Hi everybody, welcome to this week's Art of Procurement with me, Philip Eidson, and I'm joined today in sharing the co-hosting duties with Kelly Barner. And Kelly is General Manager here at Art of Procurement and also the owner and Managing Director of Buyers Meeting Point. So Kelly, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
So we're actually mixing up our This Month in Procurement format. You remember every month Kelly and I get together, talk about a lot of the things that have been happening in the past month, and we touch on a particular topic of discussion. So what we're going to do going forward, Kelly and I are still going to have a quick chat in a few moments just to talk about kind of where we are here at the beginning of April. But then we're going to head into an interview that Kelly and I both interviewed the guests together, which was just a really interesting experience, wasn't it, Kelly? You and I both doing the interview, trying not to jump all over each other, asking the questions.
And both having so many questions to ask.
But no, that's going to be what we're kind of our new format for this month in procurement. As I mentioned before, we're recording this here in the beginning of April 2020. The world has changed a lot in the last month since we did the last podcast. At least it has here in the United States. So just on a personal level, Kelly, how are you doing?
So I'm doing. And it's so funny because now I'm sure everyone's had this experience. Every call you get on or every Zoom meeting that you dial into, people instinctively say, "Oh, how are you? How are you doing?" Right? And people sort of don't know how to answer that question.
Right.
More often than not, people sort of seem to laugh because it's something that used to be a very typical friendly exchange, and now it's become sort of a loaded question.
Yeah.
From a work perspective, you and I are at an advantage in that we're accustomed to already being set up working from home. But of course, we're now balancing, kids in the house, school responsibilities, spouses spending more time in the house. And so it's certainly been an interesting time, both testing and strengthening organizational skills, flexibility, and just sort of generally being empathetic to what everybody is going through under the circumstances.
Yeah, it feels like it's cliche already at this point to say it's an interesting time, um, but it feels like
Yes.
it's maybe we've moved from looking at things day to week, and you never quite know what next week will bring. But in the meantime, as we continue to record podcasts and share content with the community, we're really trying to focus on content that is as timely as possible, that's relevant. You'll be seeing us drop more podcasts. I know we've been doing that already the last couple of weeks. And also, thinking about not just how do we react immediately, but also how can we focus to position procurement to be the most impactful in the medium term, the long term? Because I think that's something that's going to be really important. And when I think about today's conversation, so Kelly, you and I both interviewed Joe Payne, and Joe is the Senior Vice President of Source to Pay at Corcentric. And Joe's a good friend of both Kelly and I, and Corcentric, they're one of our closest partners here at the Art of Procurement. And they have been, frankly, since we started the business almost 5 years ago now. And so through the rest of 2020, we talked about different formats for this month in procurement. We're actually going to be speaking to a number of different subject matter experts once a month from across Corcentric's business to share some of the trends, the opportunities, the risks that they see in specific categories as we all get to grips with kind of what's this new normal look like for us all. So today's conversation, Kelly, I just wonder if you could share what are some of the kind of things that we got to look forward to listening to, because it was a really interesting conversation with Joe.
It was. No, it definitely was. I think for me, there were a couple of key things. One is Joe is very big picture, right? And so we all need to take the same sort of very high level point of view in these times. But the other thing is that everything that we're going through is a cyclical give and take, right? So for everything that we feel either compelled to step up and do or are specifically asked to step up and do, it is absolutely appropriate for there to be a corresponding. And so therefore I'm going to need, access to people, information, visibility, insight into timing, every single thing. It's in most cases not going to be a directive, you go do this now because of the circumstances.
Yeah.
Everybody really is stepping up. And we should be thinking about what are the things that we need as well as what are the things we're trying to step up and do.
Yeah, and for me as well, it's thinking about how do we take this, this elevated role that no doubt a lot of procurement teams are going to have in the near future, and make sure that we use that as an opportunity to really think about the medium and the long term, while looking obviously at how do we help now and help quickly and have that speed, but ensuring that the way that we respond doesn't then position us as, that's their only trick for procurement, is we come and bring them in when it's time to save money. When we don't need to save money anymore, maybe we can just pop them back in the toolbox. So we have a really interesting discussion around that notion as well. I want to get straight into the conversation with Joe. And so the first thing that I asked him, and it's something that, I try and ask all of my practitioner side guests at least, is did procurement find him, or did Joe find procurement?
Procurement definitely, I think, found me to some extent. So, I up until about a year ago, actually, I thought of myself as a career consultant. So right out of college, I went into consulting with Accenture, and I did that for a few years. And, I liked it. I liked everything about Accenture, the way they approach customers, the way they manage projects and really big change management initiatives. But I also found that, that big company, there's not a lot of impact you can have as an individual, especially early on in your career. And so I started looking for something that is more smaller company feel consulting, and came across Source One Management, which is a, procurement and sourcing focused consulting firm. Happened to be local to the area that I lived in, and had that small company vibe. In fact, when I started there, we were 10 people. So it was kind of by coincidence, although my background in college was, they called it information and operations management, which I think would be more equivalent to supply chain today, but there wasn't a lot of supply chain programs out there. So there was a bit of a confluence there, but it was somewhat unintentional, I would say.
Were there certain categories or areas of spend that you focused on as a consultant, or were you looking pretty much across the spectrum of indirect?
When we were just Source One before Corcentric acquired us, our focus was more indirect. And the reason was we were trying to fill a business need for our customers. And if you think about how procurement has kind of matured over the last 15 or 20 years, particularly in the mid-market, but also with some larger market companies, if they had procurement, it was more direct materials focused. And many companies didn't have any kind of centralization or a group dedicated to indirect procurement. And so that's kind of where we cut our teeth, was in the indirect procurement space. And, when I started at Source One, we were heavily focused in MRO and telecommunications. Those were kind of our two areas of expertise. But as we grew into almost every, category of indirect. The more complex indirect categories like marketing and HR are, we've got strong subject matter expertise in now. And then, we've gone into the direct materials space as well. So even companies that have those organizations sometimes are looking for new market intelligence or new business cases for how they can kind of remap their supply chain. And so we're helping really anything and everything tied to procurement, category management, strategic sourcing.
So Joe, in that time, you talk about the last 15 years, a lot of things have changed for procurement, things in general, but you also went from Source One to becoming part of Corcentric. What was that transition like?
Yeah, it's been an interesting few years. So we were acquired, Source One was acquired by Corcentric in March of 2018. So we're going just over our second year as part of Corcentric. And for us, it was a really easy decision to make. Corcentric's heritage was in group purchasing. So that's where they started. They were actually called AmeriQuest when they started, when they were founded by Doug Clark. And over time, they grew to be not just a group purchasing organization, but also a technology company. So they started with billing and AP solutions to help really reduce friction and connect buyers and suppliers, but not with the procurement angle, right? More on the finance side, which is really, I think, an interesting approach. And so when we saw what they were doing with their group purchasing organization, how they incorporated technology to support it, how they worked with their customers, not just to kind of leverage spend to help drive buyer-supplier relationships, but also to reduce working capital on both sides. So they're actually sitting in the middle of transactions between buyers and suppliers and extending working capital or shrinking payment terms where it makes sense. We thought it was really unique and something we didn't see in the marketplace anywhere. And Corcentric's vision was to go up what they called upstream. So they wanted that vision to extend into procurement as well as in the AP and the AR side. And they saw Source One as helping them lead into that. So for about a year, that's what we did. And then interestingly enough, in 2019, Corcentric bought Determine, which is a company that is focused on all things sourcing and procurement related from an automation perspective. So talking about procure to pay, tied to workflow and catalog management, and also things like sourcing tools and contract management tools and spend analytics tools, which was really synergistic between the Source One service offering and the Determine technology offering. So these things have blended together so well over time that we decided late last year to form a new business unit at Corcentric that basically takes the legacy Corcentric AP automation and indirect GPO and combines it with the Determine technology and the Source One service offering into something that I think is really different and not really seen in the marketplace today.
Well, and it's interesting timing too, because when you talk about legacy, right, certainly there's the backgrounds and the varied strengths of all these different organizations we've been talking about, yeah. But there's also an important procurement legacy that comes into play. And as we, have this conversation in very early April 2020, obviously everyone has sort of one eye on the economy at all times. And while it feels very different right now, this isn't the first time that strategic procurement has helped buoy organizations through a recession. So given the fact that it's, kind of part of this whole journey that we've just talked about, I'd be interested in your thoughts, both in terms of your own experience and more generally about the role of procurement in a recession. Where do we need to focus from technology, talent, and process? And maybe how do some of the priorities that we would have had 6 or 8 months ago suddenly shift in terms of our forward-looking planning?
Yeah, I would say that there's two elements to that. There's the traditional kind of how procurement is engaged during a recession, or what we're expecting to see in terms of economic downturn, as well as what procurement is tasked with during a global disaster, the likes of which we've really never seen. And how do those two things connect? And I could tell you that in a traditional recessionary period, because we're focused a lot on helping companies reduce costs, the phone probably does ring a little bit more, but I wouldn't say it's substantial. What does change is the level of urgency, right? So companies, they're always thinking about cost reduction and how can they improve the bottom line. But when you hit a recessionary period, the urgency goes way up. And so companies that maybe don't always look to procurement as part of a cost reduction solution are now going to be looking more closely at them and really trying to get procurement to commit to what can you do to help us? How does that fall in line with the other goals that we're going to have as we experience this recession and as we cut costs? So it certainly becomes more important and more critical piece of the day-to-day operations of companies, and that creates a sense of urgency. But when you tie that internal need to drive cost reduction down with the external factors of a recession or a global disaster, one thing I think about it, and it's really important for procurement to take a lead in this, is to really think holistically and long-term. Now is a good time not to be reactive and just to react to the conditions that you have, but to think about how do I create something that actually becomes an opportunity for us in the long term as an organization. And so, the example that I like to give from like a what not to do, so many companies, the first thing they're going to do when you hit this type of economic downturn, is send the standard note to all their suppliers that say, you know, we need to extend out our payment terms to 120 days, or we need 10% cost reduction. And it's like almost like a demand letter for cost reduction. And you have to keep in mind two things when you do that. One, your supply chain is going through the same issues internally that you're going through. So now's not the time to ask them for an arbitrary, you know, cut in cost or to extend out payment terms. You have to do it. I mean, you certainly have to do it, but you need to be more fact-based, right? So where are the real opportunities versus taking that sweeping approach across all your suppliers? And, you know, where doesn't it make sense, right? Who are the key suppliers that you don't want to, you know, upset during a time of crisis, that sending those types of letters or general statements could really, you know, backfire. And the second piece of it is to think about how can you really turn this into an opportunity to build relationships with your suppliers. So, you know, there's so many examples today of companies experiencing shortages. Obviously the hospitals and the masks and the cleaning products that they're running out of, and, you know, the ventilators and things like that. But other companies in the food industry, you know, in grocery, they're experiencing some of the similar challenges with PPE, with cleaning products. And, you know, if you can think about long term and make sure you're going to your suppliers that are critical in these times and saying, what can I also do for you, right? This is difficult for all of us. How can I, you know, get what I need and also make it better for you? That's not going to just help you today. It's going to help you forever, because the next time something like this happens, you're going to be higher on their list because you're treating them like a strategic supplier instead of taking that tactical approach.
No, and I think that makes a lot of sense, right? And there are going to be a lot of choices that companies and procurement are faced with in the coming weeks that will have very wide and long-ranging consequences. Before we get into some of those specific decisions and maybe some of the tactics that procurement starts to use, I just want to follow up on one thing that you said, and that was talking about urgency. You know, when I think of procurement under air quotes, normal conditions, I think of, you know, we're very methodical, we are predictable, we have our governance standards, we have our processes, and there's a reason for all of that. But when we find ourselves in times of urgency, you do move into some area of gray space, and whether that happens to be internal, you know, making it possible for a now distributed workforce to buy and receive the things that they need to function, or whether we're looking at it externally, dealing with suppliers, dealing further down into the supply chain. Where would you say are maybe the guardrails around where we should compromise and loosen some of those traditional standards because of the sense of urgency that is facing us all on a daily basis?
Yeah, you know, that's an interesting question, and it's a good point, because when things become more urgent, and when you have these types of situations, it's when you really start, when the bottlenecks in your process become much more clear, right? So in normal times, you've created a window for a process, and it could be, you know, a month, it could be a week, whatever. And then all of a sudden you need to turn things around in, you know, 24, 48 hours or less. And it's like, oh, well, it's not even possible with our existing process. So, you know, if it's things like supplier qualification and onboarding, there's a way to do that in a normal situation, and then there's a way to do that when you're out of supply or there's critical components in your supply chain. And so what companies can do to get ahead of that is, you know, when you're not in those times of urgency, to think about what are the critical elements of supply, what are the critical processes tied to that supply, and then what are the times associated with qualifying and onboarding suppliers, and what can I cut out of that when I have to? Not that it's an everyday thing, not that it's what we're going to do turn that into a standard operating procedure, but when we hit a crisis that meets X, Y, and Z criteria, we transition from process A to process B. And it's not good to start doing that during the crisis, right? It's better to do that before the crisis starts, because that's when you have a little more clarity and you can be a little more thoughtful about what you're taking out of a process or what you're adding into a process.
So something that you said, Joe, a little while ago that I picked up on was about kind of this responsibility to think about the medium term and the long term while we're in this expense reduction mode, where the urgency may be here, but this is a positive in terms of the value that procurement can bring for an organization, in these times, because it's something that we're we've got a lot of experience at doing. But on the other hand, I see that there's a danger that organizations look at procurement as being this is the one thing that procurement does, and this is the preconceived idea I've had for a long time. So I'm going to bring procurement out of my toolbox, and they're going to go and beat up a few suppliers and get some quick cost reduction. And then when I'm not in that mode anymore, I'm going to put them back in the toolbox. And then we lost the opportunity to really show the depth and breadth of value that we can bring that goes beyond it. I just wondered what your perspective was on that, and perhaps if there's ways that, as we're thinking about going through this, having this heightened spotlight on us, how we conduct ourselves to make sure that we're really thinking about the long term. Yeah.
I'll go back to a point I made earlier, which is, think about proactive versus reactive. And in times like this, tendency is just to react. My advice to folks would be take in the business's concerns and the needs and what they're asking you to do, but don't just react to those requests.
Yeah.
Make sure you just take the time to get above it, to get your head above the water a little bit, and think about if you were to approach it in a reactive way, what would be the short and long-term outcome? And then if you were to, what are the negative consequences of that? How can you prevent those negative consequences? And then how can you turn a situation like this into a long-term advantage, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you do that, right, you're going to find there's obvious answers in terms of, if I bring these 10 suppliers in and I have a conversation with them about what's good, what will help them as we get through this, recognizing what we need from them. I don't think you're going to have a problem, going back to the business, to the C-suite or whoever, and saying, I'm going to do this. I'm going to hit the targets you need me to hit, but we're also going to turn it into a positive for us because I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. What that'll do is show the business that we are considering them and we're thinking about their needs, but also thinking about it more holistically. Which for procurement, when you talk about trying to get a seat at the table, right, the C-suite or in the decision-making table, it's times like this that will show what procurement can really do, right? So it is our time to shine. I mean, when we hit crisis mode, it's our time to shine and to really give the business a view of what a good procurement really looks like.
Now, as I start to think about tactics that we can use, I think that at least in my experience, a lot of times when trying to help save money and save money quickly, that urgency has kind of failed or had difficulties when it's been a little bit of an arbitrary look and just saying, hey, we're going to task everyone within our business to save 10%, let's say, on their external expenses. And it's been more successful when you've taken a lot more kind of precise targeted approach based on market conditions, needs of the business, when it last went out to market, all that kind of thing. But a lot of time, there's a lot of organizations out there that I see certainly, and I'm sure you see as well, that don't necessarily have a good handle on what that spend actually looks like. So, we're kind of in crisis and urgency mode right now. What recommendations would you give to an organization that knows that they need to act, and they feel like the easiest thing may be just to say, okay, we're going to target cutting 10% off everything, to actually better understand their spend so they can be a little bit more targeted?
This is another great time for procurement to step in and take a leadership role. And so if you're a business that is being asked to target that type of cost reduction, for procurement to come in and take a lead and say, hold on, instead of looking at, the 10% reduction for each individual business unit, let's think about how we can do that at the top level across the entire organization. So, let's start with a spend analysis. And spend analysis and opportunity assessment is a great starting point to centralize indirect spend, but it's also a great way to quickly identify the short, medium, and long-term opportunities. I'm going to tell you, so many times when we're talking to folks, maybe outside of procurement, thinking about cost reduction, maybe the CFO or the COO, they say, oh, well, we'll just start with the biggest spends, right? Travel, is always a big spend. Benefits is a big spend. We'll just cut out of that. But those types of programs, the cuts there that are substantial are volume-based, right? Reduce benefits or stop traveling. Those will save money for sure. But if you're really thinking about, maintaining your current levels of business or not, setting, internal or external customers and just trying to reduce costs, it's not always the smallest area of spend that is going to find the biggest cost savings opportunities. So it's looking at a spend analysis, getting a handle of your spend from a procurement perspective. So not from a GL code or a business unit perspective, but saying these are the suppliers that if I put together, formulate a market basket that we can go out to market with and that we can leverage our aggregated volume to reduce costs, right? Taking those things, putting together with a procurement mindset rather than a finance mindset, and then saying, we know these are low-hanging fruit opportunities, things that are, commodity type items where maybe a GPO program would be a good opportunity. You don't need to manage the supplier. Someone else does it for you. They've already negotiated a good price, and you can flip a switch and get access to that. Or the medium-term opportunities where you're going to go out and do some sourcing, or long-term opportunities where, it's going to take a long time to transition from one supplier to another, or you have contracts in place. First step is getting the spend visibility, and then building the roadmap from there will really help you prioritize and show how you can get to that, 10% number or whatever you're being tasked with as a business, and the time, as well as the timeline it will take to get you there.
So we've talked about what procurement needs to do and the role that we need to play and the priority shifts that we need to be open to, and even maybe how other functions or executive leadership positions in the organization might see us differently or call upon us differently in these kinds of conditions. But if we think about it from sort of the flip, what would you say that procurement needs to think about asking for in order to respond optimally in these conditions? I mean, is it visibility? Is it access? Is it data? Is it technology? Is it some kind of different external support? We tend to be so focused, and we're all procurement at heart here, right? So we tend to be so focused on what do we do? How do we change? But maybe we don't always think to stop and say, okay, what do I need in order to step into those roles and get those things done? What might you suggest that procurement teams stop and look at to determine if there's something they can get from the rest of the enterprise to set themselves up for success?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is, I'm going to be a consultant again. It depends. I think that, but what it depends on really is the maturity of procurement in your individual organizations, right? So if you don't have centralized procurement and there's not a business case for it yet, what you're asking for from the C-suite or the folks in the powers that be is sponsorship. That's what you need. And you mentioned access, and I would say before access comes sponsorship. You need the C-suite to help drive the mandate for procurement within the organization. I've seen so many transformations and goals to centralize indirect procurement fail because they didn't have the adequate level of sponsorship from the C-suite. And the reality is, it's a very simple reason. It's because procurement is personal, right? Everybody thinks that they got a good deal on the things they bought. No one wants to have their shoulder looked over. And if you haven't centralized procurement, yet, then naturally the business is going to feel that way. And unless you just put a straightforward mandate out that this is going to be the way, then you're not going to get anywhere. And so once you have that access, then it becomes visibility. The visibility of getting that spend data. And if you've got disparate ERP systems, if you haven't really centralized procurement and you've got multiple ways of categorizing or coding data today, you need to get that data and you need to let procurement use it in a way that's beneficial from a supply perspective. And if you're a very mature organization and the value is already recognized by procurement, what you really need to do is enable. And not just enable procurement, because if you've already centralized and you've made that headway and you've got a robust procurement organization, what you need to think about is how to better support the business. So it changes as you mature from, what do you need to support? What does the business need to do to support procurement? To once you've centralized, what does procurement need to do to support the business? And that's where digitization and enablement comes in. How do you make the right procurement policies and procedures and processes easier to follow than the wrong ones, right? How do you drive compliance?
That's true.
How do you increase satisfaction? And so that's where digitization it becomes really important, just making it easy to follow the rules. And so it depends on where you are, you got to think about what level you're at, and that's going to dictate what you really need to ask for.
So I'm going to ask what may be a leading question. I guess it depends on what the answer looks like, because I have my own kind of experience around, I guess, the answer to it. But I'd just love to know kind of what you see. When we're in this position where, there's such a role and an opportunity for procurement to make a difference, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be given untold resources to execute on it. You still have problems with general hiring freezes across the organization. The political side of, well, they're cutting heads in this area. How come they're giving heads to procurement? And so you're tasked with doing more. At least my experience, I see that we're tasked with doing more, but with less resource. And I just wondered if that's something that you've seen, or if it's, something that's been limited to my experiences.
Well, I've already seen, I could tell you that, because of the COVID-19, a lot of our customers are furloughing resources, and procurement has not been immune to that. So I would say where we started to see it first was in travel and hospitality. So you think about, the hotel chains out there, the cruise ship lines. Some of our customers are in those industries, and we saw almost immediately when the U.S. began shutting down that there were massive layoffs in those areas.
Right.
And I think it makes sense, first of all, because those are leading industries, right, from a global perspective. So they were already seeing it in Asia, seeing it in Europe, and then once it hit the U.S., it was clear that they weren't going to be able to stay afloat if they didn't take some drastic measures. And we're going to see it in other industries as well. It's going to lag a little bit, but in, areas like manufacturing and other services and retail, it's going to happen. So what do you have to do? You're going to be tasked to do more with less. Part of that is really staying focused, right? Don't get buried. But I think what you're saying about leading the witness here is also there's other outlets, right? What can you outsource? What can you use a third party for? From a GPO perspective, from a sourcing perspective. And, we do have all those tools in place to help our customers basically be a resource extension for them. So keep that in your playbook and in your toolbox, that if you're being tasked to do more with less, there are third parties out there that can help you, and folks like Corcentric that can do it at low cost or no cost options to help through these tough times.
The reason that I bring that up as well is because I just see that, listeners know I've been heavily involved in the procurement outsourcing space as well. And you just see a shift in, you have to re-architect your business model, your procurement business model, because you have all these constraints that, and so you got to get creative, creative about how you access, like you say, different contracts through things like GPO models, creative in terms of how you access resource and how you, it's not necessarily a wholesale I'm going to replace this team that I had internally with an external team because it's easier for me to get consulting dollars than it is to get FTE sign off. But how do you kind of blend the two so that you're still really having that personal level of service for your partnership internally, but actually getting access to the expertise that's going to help you the most when you need it. And that's just a different model than what, some organizations use that as that's their go-to procurement business delivery model. But for a lot of others, there's going to be a lot of kind of organizational redesign to use this ecosystem of expertise in the market and bring that in the way that is probably most efficient and most effective.
Yeah, I would say, procurement is a very strategic element, or it should be a strategic element in most businesses. I never recommend outsourcing procurement, right? It can not only create a bottom line advantage, but done right, it creates a top line advantage as well. So it's really how do you best blend? And in a time like this, if there are staff reductions, or if it's just because of the urgency, right? You're being tasked to do your job, plus now you need to go find, new opportunities for cost savings and things like that. I think that's where third parties can come in and help support some of those types of initiatives on a temporary or even a long-term basis where applicable.
Yeah. Well, Joe, I know that it's about time to wrap up. So first of all, I want to thank you so much for joining Kelly and I on the pod today. And I just have one last question, which I often say is the kind of easy question for the podcast. And that is, if listeners would like to know a little bit more about Corcentric or connect with you personally, where would be the best places for them to go to do that?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend going to our website, which is www.corcentric.com. Or if you'd like to find me on LinkedIn, I'm on there. Just search for Joe Payne. You should be able to find me.
Okay. Well, what I will do is I'm going to put the links to the website and also to your LinkedIn profile on our show notes page for today's podcast. You'll be able to find all of those at artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. So nobody has to be furiously writing those down. And first of all, Kelly, I want to thank you for joining me. It's the first time we've done a co-hosted interview. So I want to thank you for saying yes and for supporting me in the AOP.
Always glad to be here, and we couldn't ask for a better first joint guest.
Yeah, and Joe, with that in mind, I want to thank you again for joining us, and stay safe, stay healthy.
You too. Thanks so much.
Hi there. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.